In recent weeks, we've seen a massive online cyber heist become the largest bank robbery in Brazil, with nearly $400 million stolen. However, 20 years ago, in a far more elaborate operation, a crew pulled off the largest cash heist ever on Brazilian soil. It was the morning of August 8th, 2005, and the country woke up to staggering news. One of the nation's most secure institutions, the central bank, had been breached. But this wasn't just any robbery. It would become the biggest bank heist in Brazilian history. Nearly 170 million reals, roughly $70 million at the time, vanished without a single alarm being triggered. What was most impressive wasn't the sum, but the method. The criminals had dug a tunnel nearly 80 meters long. It was a bold, cinematic plan. A highly organized criminal syndicate decided their target would be the underground vault of the central bank in Fortaleza.
How did they get in without being detected? The answer: disguise and patience. The crew rented a house near the bank and set up a shell company called Synthetic Grass. They used the property as a construction site to hide the excavation happening beneath. While they pretended to sell decorative turf, they were silently digging toward the vault. It was the perfect plan. The tunnel wasn't amateur work. 4 meters deep and 78 meters long, it featured electric lighting, a ventilation system, and even wood paneling. Dug over 3 months, it involved laborers hired under the false promise of formal employment. Many didn't even know they were participating in a crime.
In the early hours between August 6th and 7th, 2005, the final operation began. For hours, the crew moved in and out of the tunnel into the vault, where used 50 real bills were stored. Bills that were being withdrawn from circulation, but were still legal tender. In total, they hauled out 164 million, the equivalent of 3 tons of cold, hard cash. It wasn't until Monday morning that bank employees discovered the crime. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing on the alarms, just an empty vault and a tunnel hidden beneath the city. It was genius. The media swarmed the story, and it made international headlines. The entire country asked, how was this possible? How did no one notice a tunnel being dug for months, just meters away from one of the most secure buildings in the country? The hunt for the millionaire moles began. The federal police mobilized agents nationwide in Operation Mole. Months of investigations, wiretaps, and shootouts followed. Soon names surfaced. Antonio Jusivan Alves, known as Alemão, identified as one of the leaders, along with Raimundo Laurindo and Devenir Viana.
The syndicate had branches in several states and employed specialists, engineers, machine operators, accountants, and security. It was run like a corporation with divided tasks, organized payrolls, and rigid internal rules. Later testimony revealed that excavators earned about $1,000 a week under constant supervision. They used industrial tools and engineering specs to prevent a collapse. They even ran drills to test how much weight they could carry per trip. In the end, they used over 100 grain sacks and carts to move the cash to their headquarters. When police eventually raided the house, they found 50 real bills scattered across the rooms, mixed with the dirt from the excavation, a sign of the frantic pace of the getaway, while the rest of the city slept. In total, they took 164.7 million reais. The money was already promised. Each leader and financier would get 5 million, while the laborers would get around 2 million. The head start they had over the weekend helped them cover their tracks. But where did the money go? At least a third of it, about 56 million, ended up in a house in the Mondubim neighborhood. The crew hid it there to distribute shares before fleeing. However, the small denominations made large purchases difficult, and that was their first mistake. The day after the heist, members of the crew bought 11 vehicles, paying nearly 1 million reais in cash, all in 50 real bills. The dealership employees immediately alerted the authorities.
The criminals stashed 4 million reais inside the bodywork of the cars and sent them on a car carrier truck to Sao Paulo. Just 3 days later, the federal police made the first major seizure. They didn't know the exact location of the truck, but they were monitoring routes. Meanwhile, the truck driver found it strange that his boss, Jose Charles, who never traveled with him, was in the passenger seat making constant calls from payphones. During a stop, the driver noticed 50 real bills peeking out of the car upholstery. Seeing the heist news everywhere, he grew suspicious. On the highway near Sete Lagoas, he made a sharp maneuver into a police checkpoint and asked the officers to inspect his cargo. Jose Charles became the first man arrested with the stolen loot.
At the Fortaleza airport, agents found another lead. 7 people had bought tickets to Sao Paulo in cash using, you guessed it, 50 real bills. Though they used fake IDs, they couldn't hide from the security cameras. Police identified 2 leaders, Cabello and Fernandinho. Fernandinho was a known figure in the drug trade and the primary financier of the heist. Police began tailing them, hoping they would lead the way to the rest of the fortune. The planning was sophisticated, but the getaway was a mess. In the tunnel house, police found a prepaid phone card. Through that card, they tracked the number and began wiretapping the entire crew. On September 29, 2005, 54 days after the heist, the trap was sprung. Agents disguised as patrons in a bar surrounded several members of the crew as they went to pick up lunch. They were arrested on the spot. The suspicion grew from a wiretap where a member asked his girlfriend to buy a kilogram of rubber bands. To investigators, there was only one reason for that: packaging massive amounts of cash. When police raided the Mondubim house, the scene was stunning. 20 sacks stuffed with cash, over 12 million reais. Bills were scattered on tables, in wardrobes, and buried in coolers under the floorboards. But there was a darker discovery. The week before, a truck had already moved 44 million reais from that address because they simply couldn't fit any more.
What started as a criminal investigation turned into a gold rush for the underworld. The existence of millions in untraceable cash drew the attention of rival gangs, kidnappers, and corrupt cops. The lines between the law and the crime blurred. Crew members became targets of kidnappings and torture. Fernandinho, who held the largest share, was kidnapped. Even after his family paid a $2 million ransom, his body was found the next day with signs of brutal torture. Investigations later suggested he was murdered because he recognized his kidnapper, a detective from the Sao Paulo Civil Police.
Another member, Pedro, had his home invaded by men claiming to be police. He paid 2 million reais for his freedom, a bribe for silence. Days later, another group took him to a police station and demanded another 450,000. Pedro begged, saying they were leaving him in poverty. The corrupt officers actually gave him back 50,000 as a consolation prize to keep him quiet. When they came back a third time, he threatened to report them, not knowing that this time the men at his door were the actual federal police. They didn't want a bribe. They wanted justice.
The stolen millions became a curse. Members like Jean Gordo were kidnapped 3 times, paying over 2 million in ransoms just to stay alive. The brother of Alemão was kidnapped and tortured for 12 days by men looking for the loot. Even lawyers were involved. One kidnapper was caught negotiating a ransom from a law office. The federal police believe a huge portion of the stolen money went directly into the pockets of kidnappers and corrupt officials. Then there were the amateur mistakes. One criminal buried his share in PVC pipes, but they weren't airtight. When he dug it up, the bills were covered in mold. His solution? He put the millions into a washing machine with cleaning products. The money began to tear and fade. To dry it, they hung the bills on clotheslines. But then someone had the bright idea to speed it up by putting the cash in an oven. When they opened the door, they didn't find stacks of cash. They found a pile of charred, brittle ash. Millions of reais literally turned into dust.
How much was recovered? Only about 60 million reais, mostly through the sale of seized assets like luxury cars and nightclubs. Roughly 105 million reais remains missing to this day. Over the years, dozens were arrested. Some were killed in internal disputes, and others escaped. In 2023, Bocao, the engineer of the tunnel, was finally recaptured. Over 20 years, the courts have convicted 119 defendants, with sentences ranging from 3 to 170 years.
The central bank heist has become the subject of movies, series, and books. It demonstrated how organized crime could function with military-like precision. But more than a heist, it was a story of ego, greed, and human error. Despite the sophistication of the tunnel, it was the small mistakes that allowed the police to piece the puzzle together. Some say the missing millions still circulate in the black market. Others believe they are buried in a basement somewhere, waiting to be found. One thing is certain. The 2005 central bank heist remains the largest and perhaps most incredible cash robbery in the history of Brazil.
105 million reais. Still missing. Brazil is full of stories like this, hidden, forgotten, and untold. Stories the world has never heard. That's what Unknown Brazil is all about. Subscribe, and let's uncover them together. Until the next untold story.